Hello, hello. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Street League Drone Racing, and we've got some exciting updates for you today. My name is Timothy Ichiasu, Sky FPV. I'm joined by Stephen Nabe, aka Leadfingers, one of our admins here at Street League. And today we're really excited to be bringing you version 3.0.0 of the Street League rulebook. So welcome, Stephen. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Tim. You almost got that name right. It's Kanabi.
Is it No.
Yeah, it's Kanabi.
All right. Well, I
We
apologize.
tried.
I've only ever read it.
That's true.
So it's beautiful.
I usually go by Leadfingers, so it's
Yeah.
usually that.
Most people, we usually go by pilot names. That's so funny. We've known each other for how long, and we realize now that I don't know your last name, which I think speaks to that
Literally
point a
when
little
we
bit.
start the live stream too, it's great.
Right off the bat. Let's get that out of the way. Cool. So yeah, let's dig into it a little bit. So for the people in our chat, which feel free if you're in the chat, say what's up. Sounds like we've already got Sparker, J Rice, and Claymore. Which thank you for joining, by the way. For the people who are new to us, though, something that we should probably clear up right away is that we frequently update our rulebook. Our rulebook is very much a living, breathing beast, at least at this point. So that's been kind of one of the exciting things about starting Street League, is trying to figure out like all the technicalities of the rules and stuff like that. But also, it's just been really exciting to look at how the rules affect the action in the races in a very real and dynamic way every single race. So like, I think you can maybe even speak to some of the crazy things people were trying, even going into Vegas, race number 1. There was talk of like yaw wiggling your quad back and forth.
Oh yeah, so I had a little bit of a theory that I thought that we could break the spec with, and it's been proven that it doesn't work. So like, that's a good thing about like, because we throttle cap, but we don't motor output limit if you're using a 1250 kV. So if you could get the quad to run away in a controlled fashion, you could maybe get your throttle over 75%.
Right. So for those of you who don't know, we have a throttle cap in Street League, and basically the idea is that we want to try to have some control over the overall speed, the absolute speed of the drones, as our season and as our league progresses, but we still want the drones to fly good. So one of the throttle cap, the way that we have it working right now, the PID controller has the ability to ramp the motors higher than 75%. But if you're commanding max throttle and there's no crazy PID stuff happening, then you're just getting that same throttle value. But so, as Steve is talking about here, is like, if you wiggle it back and forth and cause some disturbances intentionally, the theory is that you might be able to get the PID controller to ramp up and make you go faster in a straight line. Sounds like that turned out not to be an issue in the real world, although in a theoretical sense, I imagine there's plenty to be discovered there. But who knows? Maybe we'll run into having to deal with that, and I think we've already got some ideas for it, if some of the stuff starts getting crazy in that regard. But yeah, go ahead.
Part of the fun is like trying to anticipate what's going to happen. So like, the part of the game of spec racing, and I know some of the pilots really feel this way, that like part of the game of spec racing is trying to break the rules within the rules almost.
Right. I mean, that's gamesmanship, and I think it's sometimes people will frown upon it. Sometimes people say like that's a sign that you're trying really hard. But I think you and I both, as admins of Street League, both take it upon ourselves. Like we kind of welcome the challenge a little bit. If the pilots want to get testy with the rules, then if they're able to succeed and break the spec, essentially, then we look at that as a downfall of ours, not a character flaw of theirs, because they're competitors.
Amari tuned in. He knows who we were talking about. But like, yeah, I really like that part of it, and like I think we're both just the right kind of nerds that like we've spent hours just scrutinizing every bit of this rule book, and like I like doing that. Just like one of us will be like, well, what do we regulate it this way? And then the other guy will try to break that rule, and we go back and forth until we end up with something we can't figure out how to break. And then like maybe someone else can, but like we've done a lot of work to do our best to make it so it can't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, there's so many great stories. I don't even know if maybe we'll talk about them as we go through the night. But so that's who we are. This is what we do. And tonight we're really excited because we have one of those rule updates that I was mentioning earlier available for the public. So now, right now, if you go to streetleague.io and you click on the spec tab, there'll be a link in there to download the rulebook. I'm going to triple check that that's actually working right now because we just made the update.
I just did it. It should be working.
Perfect. Cool. So that's how you get the latest and greatest version of the rules. Always, you can just check out our website, streetleague.io. And let's dig into this. So let me pull this up for our viewers. I've got a little section underneath our webcams if they want to read along on the screen, if they don't feel like going through the whole rigmarole. Alrighty, here we go. So let's kick this off. So 1.3, and that's ARM rules. We've done a little bit of like format cleanup, so you'll see some things here highlighted that are strictly like format. And so Stephen, I think you were the one who kind of separated ARM rules out into their own section because we found that that's something that we need to focus on to keep the spec approachable. So actually, before we get into that, I want to remind our live stream of our 3 guiding principles. So I'll scroll down to those, and hopefully we can start there because that's really where everything begins.
Yeah, they're also in the description, the video description at the bottom right now.
Yeah. So the spirit of the rules. Every single rule that we make is to this end. So if we're making a rule and it doesn't contribute to this in some way, shape, or form, then at us, like come at us and tell us, hey, we don't think that rule is meaningful. So the first one is to provide a framework for high quality racing. And so a lot of things come with that, but the racing itself should be competitive, it should be fair, and it should be enforceable. So that's kind of what that's about. Second one is to be approachable, enjoyable, and affordable for both pilots and brands. And that's something I think that a lot of other racing leagues completely leave out is the brands portion. But obviously we want to make sure that from an affordability standpoint, people can afford to do drone racing at all, because that's something that I think is in jeopardy a lot of the time. I think that it has been in jeopardy since the sport's inception, and so it needs to be approachable and affordable. And obviously, we're doing this for fun. We want to enjoy each other's company, so that the enjoyability part's important too. The third one is to stimulate meaningful innovation in the space of UAV performance. So we really value that performance aspect of, we're all tinkerers, we're all nerds, we all love coming up with new cool things that we can do to a drone to make it fly better, or, and that's part of what we enjoy. So we really value that, and we want to have spec racing that's close, but we do also want people to have that opportunity to use their big brains and do something cool. So rewind with that in mind. Let's get into the ARM rules. Stephen, do you want to talk us through some of these?
Yeah, so I'll kick us off here. So initially, I think it was before the Street League Citrus Spring race, we did think about ARM rules a bit. Mm-hmm. And I think the ARM rule was a circumference minimum that was based on the Source 1 7-inch. Because the Source 1 7-inch is the most easily accessible frame for our league, right? For Street League.
We have that here.
Yep. So if anyone just wants to grab a quad and as cheaply as possible race Street League, that's the quad to do it. So we don't want the quads to be weak and breaking, so we basically just measured the circumference of the arm and said, okay, that's the minimum circumference. Without thinking that someone was going to say, well, I could get tube arms of that circumference and stick it on my Street League quad, and we'll see how that works. And Engineer did that for the Citrus Spring race, and the quad was absolutely broken.
It was so fast.
It was so much faster than, and we were like, we thought his throttle cap wasn't set. It was so much faster. And then he's flying it, and he one hard crash, and all of the arms break. The whole thing's destroyed.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay, well, the tube arms he was using were really cheap, so he could just keep replacing them. But that sucks.
Right.
Who wants to show up at a race with 10 sets of arms, and every time you crash, you got to swap an arm out? Where,
Right.
like, I wish I had my prig here. I didn't grab it for the stream.
Here, I'll show it for people.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever seen anyone break an arm ever.
It's super tough on these. Now, to be fair to Patrick, I think that he was under the impression that the arm quad could be made to be durable. It could be made to be something that would be enjoyable and approachable.
Sure.
But I think that he was like focused on like, I just got to get something ready for the race. I got to make sure it's like actually is there and shows up, and I can practice on it and whatnot. So like, I don't think he was attempting to break the spirit of the rules, but he was definitely trying to be a competitor, which is something that we absolutely expect every single pilot to do. But then like, Steven, I think you and I were worried about it because we kind of saw what was coming. Because building a tube arm frame is pretty tough. It's a difficult engineering feat. And so I think it's one of those things like it would take time to do it properly, but where we kind of got caught out was that we hadn't put enough thought yet into what a quad like that could do to the spirit of why we're doing this. And on the other hand, we didn't really want to ban that style of quad, but I think we did realize pretty quickly we need to define like a type of quad that is definitely going to be durable.
Yeah, and like, you know, it's nothing like saying like, oh, Engineer was trying to do something bad by doing that. He looked at the rules and said, I think I know how to make this quad go faster, and that's exactly what we want. That was great. We just learned from that lesson that our spec encouraged pilots to build a quad that was not fun to live with.
Yeah.
Was the main thing, because like no one wants to break arms like that. So we kind of put our heads together and we were like, do we ban tube arms? But like, no, we don't want to ban the shape.
Right.
And how do we define this? So what we ended up doing was we're going to regulate the amount of carbon used. You have to have a certain minimum amount of carbon in your arm. And we did that with both the circumference and a cross-sectional area spec. And let's just define cross-sectional area real quick, because we're going to be talking about it for a minute.
So I'm going to scroll down to this figure so that people can look at it while we talk about it.
So the cross-sectional area is if you take anything, but we're doing the quad arm right now, and you cut it like it's made of cake. You cut it. And then you look at the area of that block that's left. That's your cross-sectional area. You cut a cross-section, you measure that area. So the new rule is there's a circumference rule, which is the same as it was before. And now there's this additional cross-sectional area spec. And that basically says you have to have this much carbon in your arm. You're not allowed to have less.
And for the most part, I think that it gets really tricky because we didn't want this to turn into an arms race at a material level. So there's a lot of different ways that you could get around, like either just the cross-sectional area or the circumference rule. And so I think that ultimately it was the combination of both of those that hopefully should let us have a more durable spec going forward. But this is one of the areas of competition where we really have a strong focus at the moment, because this is going to be one of the first things we expect people to try to break in order to gain an advantage. And
yeah, it's aero. Like I think that was something we're really learning, that especially now that these pilots have enough weight to play with to do aero prints and all this stuff, they're gonna do it, and it's a big deal.
And we encourage it, because that's something that drone racing hasn't gotten to experience yet. It's a drone that's aerodynamic, which is like kind of a crazy thought, but it should be the way it is, I think.
Yeah, and like in traditional 5-inch racing, you don't need it, because these drones, they're like Hot Wheel cars. They're all engine.
Yeah.
You don't need aerodynamics when you can just put more power down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot closer in that sense to like drag racing, where just put the big engine on there and you can go fast, cut as much weight as you possibly can out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where our arm rules are at the moment. I'm saying that 5 times fast. But yeah, so it's basically the cross-sectional area and then the circumference. And as we're going through these, if anybody has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you just want to say what's up, feel free as well.
So before we move on from the arm, so I have an additional document that we got to format a little bit nicer, but it's more or less some explanations and stuff. So I have like example calculations and stuff. So for anyone being like, oh, well, I want to build a tube arm frame, how big does the tube have to be? So the absolute minimum size tube arm frame would be a 3.4 millimeter outer diameter tube with a 2.7 millimeter wall thickness. That's the minimum. The first size that I found that's kind of practical is a 14 millimeter outer diameter tube with a 2.5 millimeter wall meets the spec. So if you have a bigger tube or a thicker wall, you're in the spec.
So I guess for reference, so you can get a kind of an idea of the minimum cross-sectional area. This is the source one that we were talking about. We kind of have been using this as our weakest possible quad that you could fly, and we're making sure that all the rules are kind of using this as a baseline. But ultimately, this quad is more than robust enough for years of drone racing before you break anything. So this frame, if I remember correctly, is 6 millimeters by, what was it, 14, I believe?
I think so. I just got a message that our background music is a little loud.
Sorry about that. Let me drop that down a little bit. Cool. Should be a little lower now. So yeah, this is the minimum cross-sectional area and circumference, and we've kind of gone by this. So the tube arms that Lead Fingers are describing are equivalent. What was it? Was it the cross-sectional area that ended up being the deciding factor, or was the circumference the one? Do you know?
For no, the 3.4 millimeters outer diameter and 2.7 millimeter wall is the minimum of both.
Oh, so it actually lines up for both of them simultaneously.
Well, no, you'll never be able to buy a carbon tube of that size. It just doesn't exist.
Well, sure, but
that's the mathematical minimum if you were going to do a hollow tube arm.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you did a solid tube, you couldn't go under the 3.4 millimeters OD.
Okay.
And so that's where that minimum comes from.
Yes.
And then to meet the amount of carbon, you need at least a 2.7 millimeter wall. So that's why I rounded up to the next one. If you did a 14 millimeter OD and 2.5 millimeter wall, that's the closest round number that you'll probably be able to find.
Okay. And Amari asks a really good question. He's saying, and that measurement is taken at the thinnest portion of the arm, I assume. Yes, this
Yeah.
does say across the thinnest portion of the arm's length. And I believe that is cross-sectional area must be greater.
Yeah.
So the cross-sectional area is for the total of the arm. The circumference is for the thinnest portion.
Mm-hmm.
So let's.
Oh no, it's cross-sectional area at the thinnest portion.
It does not say that.
Damn. How do we miss that?
It does not say that. But that's. We'll see if that comes into play. If anyone's gonna bring it into play, it'll be Amari.
That's someone's gonna mess up. Of course, the thing we overlook. That kind of brings on a thing. After we made this spec, we had to define what an arm was.
Yes, that was a difficult thing actually. So we did that at the top here. So the arm shall be defined as the primary load-bearing material which spans from each motor to the adjoining portion of the frame. A frame may have several arms per motor. So you are essentially, Amari says the loading side. If anything, that actually hurts you, Amari. We did at the thinnest portion, but the way it's worded right now, it's actually for each arm, total cross-sectional area of its arm. So it is for all arms total, their total cross-sectional area must be that. So it doesn't really care about thinnest portion. That thinnest portion still also has to abide by that.
Oh Lord, we might need a v3.0.1 right now.
Yeah, if we do 0.1. So, and to be fair, also, this is one of the reasons we're doing this live stream, is because I don't think we really pretend to know it all. Most of the time, we know a lot because we've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this stuff. However, a lot of the input for our rules has come directly from our pilots, so that is what it is. So let's move on here. Let's see, what's the next thing?
Well, this is one that might be coming into play soon with some of the testing that has going on. Is the stock minimums that we have. I know it's section 2.4 for motors.
Let me go back up.
Which I think this was set for a while, but it's worth mentioning that we have for certain parts right now, specifically motors, they have to be for sale for you to race them. You can't show up with the motor that no one else can buy. So, but you could show up at the race with the motors, but unless there are 40 motors for sale, you may not race those. So there's no custom stuff. It's like a stock rule, like car racing. You know, there has to be 300 cars sold in the country for you to be able to race it, kind of thing.
Jay Rice wants a clause.
The Jay Rice clause, yeah, that's
clause.
He's doing a little testing right now.
I love it. Cool. So that one's pretty straightforward. I think we just bumped the number, right, from what it previously was, or did we change what the verbiage was?
I think we changed the verbiage a little bit. I was just in my head because I know Jay Rice was showing us some motors that he's testing, and I'm like, oh, too bad we can't race those at the next race because we didn't order enough for our test batch.
Unfortunate. Yeah, see, we're pushing ourselves out of the rules. That's crazy. All right, so 3.5, all flight control and power systems may only be powered by a single battery which meets the specifications below, or above, actually. And so basically, if it's a spec battery, that is the only thing that you may be powering your flight control and power systems. Notice that this doesn't explicitly say LEDs, and that was something we were a little unclear on before. So one of the things that we're trying to do as best we can is encourage pilots to be running LEDs, because we think that they really add to the racing in so many different aspects. And so the thought process always comes in with a tryhard. They're going to be like, oh, well, that's all that energy is going to the LEDs instead of going fast. And so we wanted to make sure that if you so chose, you could power your LEDs from a separate flight pack, but that pack can't be used to power other parts of your powertrain.
So I just want to loop back real quick because Gregory Hurst brought something up in the chat. Gregory, there have to have been 40 motors sold to the public in the past, kind of thing. So like if the motors you're currently using are out of stock, that's fine. That happens all the time.
That's not an issue. The issue is if you're coming out with a motor for the first time. And then if it goes out of stock after that point in time, not a big deal.
That's okay.
But the idea is that I can't have connections with a manufacturer that can wind me a super hot motor, and I can't go win races with that because they're only in stock when I need them. They have to have been available to the public when they were released. So basically, you can't run custom gear. Is how that I think we were interpreting that. And so if you think that rule could be interpreted poorly, go ahead and let us know. Shoot us an email at info@streetleague.io. If you have some concerns over the rule, we will definitely read those and take them into account.
Yeah, so sorry to derail the battery thing. That was just a really good point that I want to make sure that we answer Gregory's question. But for batteries, I think a big one that came up after, I think this was after the Vegas race, where a lot of the X-Class guys were like, oh, I know how to make batteries faster. We're going to run batteries in parallel. So like two 1100 milliamp hour 5S in parallel should be faster than a single 2200.
Yeah.
And that turned into, well, now to be competitive, you got to buy twice as many batteries that are smaller, and the cost goes up. And
that gets a little, that starts to affect the approachability. And something else to recognize here, I think we've seen this in other specs. We've seen it in Freedom Spec, and now just last weekend we saw this with Amari taking advantage of some of the rules in Tiny Trainer, where he's running two batteries. Bigger batteries. An expert drone pilot will know that a bigger battery will always maintain that voltage for longer, so you can spend more energy and still be maintaining a higher voltage, and that means you're maintaining a higher RPM throughout the flight. That's something that you wouldn't really know if you don't race, and so that's why I'm really happy that a lot of our admins are actual pilots, because it makes a big deal when you're trying to make rules. And I know that that's not to bash any of the other leagues. Like Amari is looking for every little crevice that he can find. He's done a really great job of it. So every spec is better as a result of Amari. And he even got his own clause, which we'll be getting to next. So the Amari clause, 4.3. The Amari clause. Propellers must be directly affixed to the motors such that they spin at the same RPM under normal operating conditions. I think he'll be happy to see this one. So we got to talk about why this is a rule. It seems pretty wild that it even needed to be, but I'm kind of gassed up about it because it was such a cool experience.
It was such a cool idea, and I knew there was something coming because you had hinted at it, but we had no idea. So when Amari pulled out a quad wrapped in a sweatshirt, I was so excited because I knew something was about to happen. And when he pulled it open and he had geared up his propellers, because our spec was a motor RPM spec.
Yes.
So if you gear it up to the propeller with a positive gear ratio, now your propeller is spinning faster than the motor, but the motor's spinning the spec speed. And it was just it was one of those things that was so simple you don't even think about it until it happens, and then it's obvious.
And it was funny because Amari described what he was thinking of doing a couple weeks before the race. I think it was maybe 2 weeks before the race was when he first brought it up. But then it was really funny because I was like, there's no way like you're actually gonna do that, right? He's like, I might. And then it wasn't until like 1 week before the race, I think, when he started actually constructing something and he showed me what it was. Um, and it was great. Um, and so the big thing that I thought was that the mechanical complexity was going to completely prohibit it from even working at all. You like nobody ever puts gears on a racing drone and expects it to fly um, in a performant fashion, but he flew it and it flew great. And he actually, I believe it was Corey Miwo who helped him tune it, and they got a really good tune on it. It flew really well. Um, and I think there were only a couple of aerodynamic reasons actually why it didn't outperform other drones significantly. So it was kind of interesting to see that it didn't actually pan out, but the potential was absolutely there. And it was one of those things where obviously I think it's like detrimental to the approachability of the sport. So we had to make a rule about it, but that was kind of what Amari was going for. He knew like well ahead of time. I told him when he had the idea, I was like, if that works and it's faster, it will be banned. But absolutely go for it and demonstrate that it has that potential first. Um, and so he asked me like, don't say anything because I don't want my competitors trying to do the same thing. Like, and so for the integrity of his attempt at innovation, I didn't say anything until the race, and he showed it off. And it was pretty cool. I thought it was a really healthy way of trying to innovate, but also enforce rules that are inclusive.
Yeah, I think it was just like, it was really just a positive experience for everyone. Like, he made this crazy thing, and it was faster. It was less. There was other easier things you could do the quad to make it faster than he got out of that.
It was interesting because Engineer's quad ended up being significantly faster than that one.
Yeah.
Just from aero alone, nothing else. Aero, and he had sand in his arms also, which was super funny because while it's not against the rules, it was literally just to make weight. But the sand in the arms actually, we learned, ate up all of the motor vibrations and caused the cleanest tuned quad we had literally ever seen, which was just so funny.
It was jaw-dropping to the point where really like fast. I think when more tube arms come out, people are going to start filling their tube arms with stuff because like it did amazing things for the gyro.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
FP Vegan says F1 limits the fuel flow. Is there a way to limit power draw from the battery? So that's actually a really great statement. Something that was actually something we considered at the beginning of this, because what we've learned essentially is that in terms of your ability to produce momentum, you can think of the entire system like a pipe. You've got your tube, and that is your energy, that's your quad, right? And you've got energy that it is expending and energy that it is receiving. And so the two really obvious ways of trying to maintain a spec are to regulate that at either one end of the tube or the other end of the tube. And you could do both, but it ends up being redundant. So we have essentially decided to regulate that at the exiting portion of that tube, the energy output. And so that's why we chose to do the RPM thing, because we found that it was a lot more enforceable, it was more approachable, and all of those things about sort of the spirit of the spec that we have below. We found it conformed to those a little bit easier to regulate things at that end of the tube. However, I think it's still on the table in the future to start taking a look at regulating things at the energy input side of things, because I do think that there's a lot more fairness that could come from that if you could do it in a very approachable and fun manner. But right now we don't have the hardware to do it super well, and that's where it gets a little tricky.
Yeah,
that's a really great question.
Part of like making these rules and trying to enforce a spec is you got to take into account what can we measure and what's enforceable. So like all of our drones, you can do a voltage and an amperage readout, but the amperage readout on our drones is terrible, and so is the voltage. It's just not calibrated well, because those are difficult things for a digital computer to be calibrated. You spend hundreds of dollars on a calibrated multimeter,
right,
and your flight controller is not going to do it. But measuring RPM, the digital computer is really good at that. So that's why it's at this time, at least, it's easier for us to regulate that.
And we actually ran into, to kind of demonstrate this point, we ran into an issue at Citrus Springs, where people were charging their batteries to the regulation voltage, which is 4.25 per cell, I believe. And we realized that when you put a battery on one person's charger versus another person's charger, they would read different voltages. And so if you had a hot charger, technically you could have like 1/100 of a volt more than somebody else, and you probably can calibrate chargers as well. So you could get a little tricky with that. And I think I say that just to demonstrate how difficult the energy input measurement is. And the obvious solution to that is you have like a golden standard of voltage measuring. So you have like one multimeter, and that's the multimeter that you need to abide by when you're testing your batteries. I think we may have that in Cali Clash if people start getting called out.
I 100% did purchase a multimeter, and we'll have it at Cali Clash. So like we're not gonna, at least not at this time, like make people calibrate their HOTAs. But if anyone's looking a little spicy, I might come over to that HOTA with my multimeter, and if it looks like you miscalibrated it on purpose,
or if
not going to go well.
Or if the pilots want to get nitpicky and start calling each other out, you may be asked to wiggle the quad around and expend some energy on the line before you take off. And it could come to that. It depends on your competitors and how close things are and how competitive they want to be. But yeah, so we've started learning throughout this whole process. So anywho, let's jump on to the next thing. So
I want, before we get to the I want to do 5.1 and 5.2, which I highlighted here, because this is actually something we changed before Citrus Springs.
Okay.
Because our rule before for LEDs, you needed to have at least one LED on top of the drone and one LED on the bottom of the drone. And because we wanted LEDs everywhere, right? So you can see the drones while you're racing. But then I believe it was Free came out with this print that had LEDs along the side of the arms of the drone. And it was awesome. You could see it from everywhere. It was inexpensive to light it up. It looked super cool. It was everything we wanted people to do with LEDs.
Right.
But by the rules as written, it was illegal because there was no LED on the top and on the bottom.
Which is what the original rule was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then, we didn't want to tell him no, because we loved those LEDs. We thought they were amazing. So we actually had to dive back into it and are like, okay, let's not regulate where people put their LEDs. We don't care where they are. We care if we can see them. So we did visible from the bottom, visible from the top, and then we had to break that, right? As we're going through this process, we're constantly making rules and then breaking them ourselves. So the way to break that would be if you took a single LED and you stuck it out the side of your flight controller, you could see it from the top and bottom, but not the left and right. Right. So then we added another, the LED must be visible by a significant field of view from all 6 cardinal directions.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to bring up, we can show kind of on screen.
Oh, yeah.
Let me see if I can do this.
Okay,
so here on screen, we've got, it's a sideways view, so you'll have to afford us that, but that's okay. So this is how Freeze Quad looked, and I don't know if you guys can tell, but it looks pretty cool. Like that LED setup is just phenomenal. And so obviously the LEDs are only technically visible from the sides. They weren't visible from the top, or they weren't mounted to the top and the bottom, but they are visible from the top and the bottom. And so that's kind of where we came to this conclusion. Because yeah, that's an awesome LED setup, and definitely within the spirit of the rules. So
yeah, that was something that a pilot was doing that was against the rules, but it was in the spirit of the rules. So that was a failure with the rules, not with the pilot. The pilot was doing a great job.
Yeah.
So we fucked up and we had to fix it so that those were legal and like they looked great. And my next prig is gonna have those. I think they're so cool.
Yeah. Amari is saying the check-in process should involve calibrating your charger, which would be super interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to having some minor penalties for having mischarged batteries, and then on our part, maybe we could do a better job of like educating people, like how to calibrate your chargers and stuff like that, because it matters a lot for spec racing. It's very often overlooked.
Yeah, and
cool.
Maybe that's something, I don't know, we haven't experimented with it, but maybe that's something like for champs, because champs is going to be competitive as hell.
Champs is going to be very competitive.
A little bit of extra time at a check-in process might be something we look into for that.
Yeah. Cool. So let's see, what else do we have? So we've got 6.2. The drone must not be constructed in such a way as to shed weight during normal operation by design or negligence. Pilots whose quads have repeatedly shed weight due to negligence will be penalized at the race director's discretion. So yeah, this was something that was this was one of those rules you don't want to make, but it does matter, I think, because it can affect other people's preparedness. So we found that like a lot of people will come into Street League and maybe it's not something that they're super serious about right off the bat, but they Hyper knows what we're talking about. So they may end up doing things like strapping rocks to their quads, because their quads weren't like designed with all the nice 3D prints and stuff ahead of the time. But we did find that could affect other people's readiness, not just that pilot. And so if it was the type of thing where it was just causing that pilot issue, we wouldn't have really cared so much, but we did run into some situations where this kind of shifted the race a little bit to not be as easy to regulate as we had hoped. So we do have this clause in here for basically saying like, hey, you're expected to be at weight. You can't be just strapping random stuff to your quad. Like if it's insecure and it keeps falling off every other heat, and we have to keep checking you every heat to make sure you're at weight, or other pilots have to keep calling you out. That's not super fun for anybody. We don't really want to spend all race long weighing quads. We would much prefer to be racing. So this is kind of an effort to try to make sure that we're spending as much time racing as possible.
Yeah. And it's a safety thing too, because like even as much as these are slower than normal drones, at max speed they're still getting above 60 miles an hour, and the way our tracks are designed, you're gonna hit max speed.
Mm-hmm.
So if all of a sudden some parts come flying off your drone at 60 miles an hour towards the pits, it could be a really bad situation. So but like stuff falls off drones, if you clip a gate and your GoPro comes flying out, like that might happen, or you'll lose a zip tie or something. Those are things that happen during the race, and we don't want to penalize people for it.
Right.
Like, oh, you came in after a race and you were grinding props with someone, and they a zip tie or two got knocked off your drone, and now you're a gram underweight. We don't want to penalize you for that, because that's just racing.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if it keeps happening, or it's obvious that things were designed to fall off your drone, it's not okay anymore.
Yeah. Um, Gregory Hurst says, so no Bombay Doors? That's unfortunate, but yeah, sadly it means that. Well, I mean, you could do Bombay Doors if you wanted. It would just have to be dropping excess weight.
So, so FP Vegan mentioned, do we weigh before and after racing? So for Elite 8, we do measure but in the past we were measuring after racing. Then for Cali Clash, we're going to be measuring before and after racing.
Yeah, that's the idea at least.
And it's really the before is what we're more interested in. Because we want to make sure that everyone is spec before they mess up.
And that saves us from a lot of really difficult situations as race directors, because it always really sucks to have a heat go, and then after the heat, you have to tell somebody that their heat didn't matter, and that is especially heartbreaking when it's something that you can't even prove whether it was intentional or not. You don't want to end up in that situation, and I don't think we've ended up in that such situation yet that I can remember, but I really do not look forward to it. So I would way rather tell a pilot like, "Hey, you got to fix your stuff or you're gonna miss the heat," before they've flown and before they've invested emotionally in that heat. I would way rather have dealt with that beforehand. So yeah, we try to, for the Elite 8 at least, we do try to do the testing before the heats, and then for points rounds, which all pilots get to participate in, we'll do randomized checks, and the idea is that you could try to cheat a couple heats, but you might get caught after some period of time of doing that. So usually it's not in your best interest to cheat.
Yeah, and during points round, like we check everyone at when they check into the race, and then we'll grab people's quads kind of randomly, or if we see someone, we might grab a quad. But besides that, it's a little bit of a self-regulation thing, where because the pilots can call out another pilot and they can come to the race directors and be like, hey, I think this person's quad is, underweight, or I saw them messing in their OS, or they plugged it into a laptop, and I thought I saw them messing with their throttle cap, or whatever it is. And we will spec check them. That's 100% a thing that we do kind of rely on our pilots for.
Yeah. Amara brings up a really good point that drone pilots shouldn't be retrieving their own drones after heats, and that's something that we had wanted to bring into our process for Citrus Springs, but I think we've got 3 guys right now running this whole show. A fourth, if we get a fourth guy doing race directing with us, that's probably what he will be doing, and we may end up doing that for Cali Clash as well, where we do like allocate somebody's time during Elite 8 specifically to go grab quads and collect them. Because I totally agree, like, you could go grab your quad, you could slap a weight on there, and then get away with some shenanigans. So, and Hyper saying, just don't cheat. And I totally agree. On the pilot side, yeah, obviously just don't cheat. Usually it'll be easier depending on how good you are. If you're almost the best, I would argue it is easiest to cheat. And so as a racing organization and as a league, we understand that like cheating will always be a thing in sports. Like it's not going away, it's human nature. So we're trying to make sure that the pilots who are participating in our league in an honest fashion understand that we are making great effort to prevent cheating. I think something that is a great example of why this is so important is you hear about Armstrong cheating in cycling, and he was doping, and that was a thing that at the time all cyclists were pretty much doing. And so he was in this really weird situation where by not doping, he really had no shot of winning. By doping, he was arguably competitive with the other major players. Obviously, doping's wrong, don't do it. But from our perspective, that's a failure of both him and the racing league. Two groups of people failed there, and so a lot of the cyclists who were competing at the time got robbed of their opportunity to do well by not cheating. And so, in my opinion, that's that part, their loss, is partially on the that is partially the responsibility of the racing organization or the league. So we want to make sure that other pilots trust to race in our league because they understand and they believe that we will do our best to catch cheaters and also make sure that you're not incentivized to do any trickery anyway. We would like to make it as hard to cheat as possible and make it like what you were saying, Hyper, where it's harder to cheat than it would be to win legitimately. So that's our kind of, I can't say guarantee because we're fallible, but that's our effort to our pilots.
The other thing is, if we've definitely, as far as software spec checks, been a little gun shy with the Betaflight RC3 or RCs, 4.3 RCs out right now, because pretty much everyone's running them. And if you're on the wrong configurator for the wrong release candidate, it'll mess up the quad.
Right.
Which is making us as race directors really hesitant to plug in quads. We learned that lesson in Vegas, that like some quads got plugged in and it wiped a bunch of things and then everything has to be reset up.
Yep.
And so we've been a little bit gun shy about plugging in people's quads. But it seems like hopefully RC6 is the last one. And once 4.3 official comes out, we're plugging in quads left and right. So update.
You should update. I think what we're going to Leadfingers and I actually have not talked about this yet, but in Citrus Springs we had a Python script that we were using to do some portions of the spec checking, and we learned that while it didn't ever corrupt anybody's Betaflight the way that Betaflight's configurator does, it did accidentally change their rate profile to profile 1. So that caused some people issues in practice rounds, but we figured it out before actual racing began. We may have a comeback of that for Cali Clash, just so that we can lighten our load and actually like make sure that we're spending the most time racing. But regardless, it's a really good idea to try to keep your gear up to date because we're going to try to conform to that most latest and greatest stuff if we can. But with that said, we're officially supporting official releases. So release candidates are good, but it's not. We don't take responsibility for issues that occur as a result of you beta testing software.
And it's also with the Python script was, I think it was leaving people on rate profile 6, which I know most people don't set
6?
up.
That's what it was.
But it's not something that we mandate. It's something we recommend. Is you for a street league quad, because there's the throttle cap and the motor output limit and all this stuff, you should copy your PID and rate profile to every available profile, because then there's no question, are you on rate profile 1 or rate profile 2? When we look in the software, if we see that you have a rate profile switcher on a switch in your radio and one of those rate profiles doesn't have a throttle cap,
oh man,
now we got to assume you didn't have the throttle cap, where if every single rate profile is set up exactly the same, or at least all with the throttle caps, then there's no question, because that's what I do in my quad. I have 6 rate profiles with the throttle cap, and I have 3 PID profiles with the motor output limit.
Yeah, so the nice thing about the Python script was that while it was going through your rate profiles, it was actually setting the throttle cap so that you didn't have to. The idea was that it would save anyone from running into an issue that Amari ran into before we had a rule about this. So in Vegas, we ran into the issues with Betaflight. And one of the things that happened was Amari's quad presumably got plugged in to, it was on the new Betaflight firmware. It got plugged into an old configurator, the latest stable configurator, and he was on the release candidate. and not only did it mess up a lot of his settings, but I believe that it also changed the rate profile that was selected. Now, the unfortunate part about that was that your throttle cap is associated to the profile, and so all of a sudden he flew a heat and didn't have a throttle cap, and everybody knew it. Like, it was really obvious that he was going significantly faster than the quad should have been able to go. So unfortunately, we had to disqualify that round of points for him. So those points didn't count because he didn't have the throttle cap. And what was even more unfortunate is I believe it happened a second time where we then did a spec check as a result of that. He fixed it in his OSD before the spec check, and then we ran the spec check, and then I believe it may have happened to him a second time. And so then I believe at that point we were in the Elite 8. And so then his first Elite 8 run got disqualified because then again he didn't have that going. So it was super unfortunate chain of events. So that was why we kind of tried to do the Python script to avoid doing all of this in the Betaflight configurator. And maybe someday we will have a dedicated Betaflight dev to help us out with some of these things, because that would be really awesome. We're trying to push not just drone racing, but also the tech of drone racing, because I think spec racing demands and could benefit from some better tech, and really creates an awesome use case for it too. So anyway, it was also funny because we recently were featured in the Joshua Bardwell live stream, and one of the really fun things that was commented by, I believe it was Blunty, but he wondered if somebody mentioned like, oh hey, well they could just put it on a Switch and cheat, but maybe they don't care about the spirit of competition as much. And I kind of laughed at that because this is hard, and I think that both of them understand that this is a really hard thing to do. And so the first impression might be, oh well, maybe they just haven't been rigorous with it. So it was kind of funny to me because you and I both have spent many sleepless nights going over every single one of these processes that make sure you can actually have somewhat fair racing.
Yeah, and I think that goes to like they were comparing like, oh, like Freedom Spec does the hardware spec, that you need these pieces of hardware, and then we don't care what you do with software because we know you're on the right hardware.
And that has the benefit of being easy to enforce.
Yeah, which is 100% valid. I don't want to say it's not a valid thing for them to do. But where we went pretty much just with software, where now we even run different KV motors and all this stuff, and there's a lot of headaches that come with that.
Yeah, and we knew they were coming.
Yeah, there's no surprises. But the advantage of that, doing a software spec, is it allows all these different motors to be using. Now we have people running there's 2 different Brother Hobby motors people are using, and now I'm running the Pyrodrone Hyperlights, and I'm really enjoying those. And there's Xnova 2808 motors, and I think we have a list of like 10 motors that you could presumably use in Street League, and that's awesome.
Yeah,
like that's the coolest thing.
I've gone down and I've highlighted for our viewers why we do that, and that is the spirit of the rule. It's we want to make sure that this is approachable to several different brands, because that's something that I think is really important for FPV. It doesn't exist without brands selling us really awesome tech, so we're glad to be able to do that. Let's get through the rest of our rules. Let's see what else we have. Let's see, what was the next thing? It was...
we did starting blocks, if you want to talk about that.
Oh yeah, we did make a little tweak on starting blocks, I believe. So 13.2, pilots may be allowed to bring their own starting blocks. Alternatively, the starting surface may be provided and possibly required by the race director on a race by race basis. So we got a lot of questions about some guys that were developing some really cool starting blocks, and they're like, hey, is this like street legal? And we kind of had to like talk amongst ourselves and figure out like, what do we do with that, right? Because starting blocks can get pretty crazy. Like you could have a bungee cord and release mechanism and like make your drone go faster and all sorts of crazy things. And so what we decided basically, and what we feel like is generally true, just is sort of the law of the land in most races, is that either people are allowed to bring their own starting blocks and the race director can say, I don't like those. And if the race director says, I don't like your race blocks, then he may mandate his own race blocks that he deems to be equal for everybody. And so we're really making sure that we give the power to the race director ultimately to decide what's fair or not for a start block.
Yeah, there was someone, I can't remember who it was, but they had one of the ones where you put it on and it lets you preload on the block, so it's got bearings and a rocker, and he's like, I think it was one of the California guys, maybe it was Z-Stone or something. I don't know if he's a California guy.
Yeah, I'll look around and see if I can find it.
And he's like, is it street legal? And I'm like, this is what if you want to race that, this is what you do. You build 4 of them, and when you show up at a race, you bring all 4 and you show them to the race director and say, hey, look at these cool things I made. Can we use these while racing today? And if the race director likes that idea, then that's up to him, and like that's awesome.
Yeah.
And then we made these rules for like most of the races we run. We don't provide starting blocks because we're like traveling to run these races. So we needed a set of rules so that the pilots could bring their own and be confident that they can use them.
Yeah. So that was our thought process there. Hyper says, I'm gonna butcher the name. I've already done one tonight. I'm gonna go 2 for 2. You think? Avi Gileadi? We'll see. We'll see how close that is. I'm sure Hyper will let me know. But he says he makes those rocking stands. Yes, those are the ones that we were looking at. Was the rocking stands that are made of carbon fiber, I believe, and aluminum parts, and they were super cool looking. And Amari says, so what you're saying is design a race block that just looks like a normal launch block.
Hey, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it might as well be a duck. So yeah, you do what you want, bud.
I want to see Amari game the launch block rule.
Yeah, go for it.
That's what I want to see. I want to see him break the spec, and then we will make the rule appropriate. He'll get a second clause. I'm sure
it'll be the Amari 2 clause.
I think Amari values clauses in the rule book more than season points. Okay, so moving on. We've got 15.5. Pilots who fail to advance the finals will be ranked in the following way. And this refers to something we hadn't defined before, but which we have simply defined here to be the same thing that we have been doing all season. So once you're in the, I'll give it the TLDR. Once you're in the Elite A, once you get into that top 8 bracket, if you fail to make it to the top 4, then you're essentially going to be ranked against those bottom 4 guys as though you were running a new set of points rounds. And so if you know that you're going to lose, let's say you're racing and you know Amari's going to take that heat win, and so he's going to be the last pilot to advance. You still need to race as fast as you can, because you are essentially racing the ghost of the other group of top 8 pilots. And so if you want to maximize your position, you are still incentivized to be going as fast as you can, even if you think that you're the 5th place pilot. Even if you're not advancing to finals, there's still that 5th through 8th spot. And this is basically incentivizing you to go as fast as you can to make sure that you maximize those points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a 30-point swing. It's a big difference.
Yeah, it makes a lot of difference. Potentially, primarily season points wise, but those season points could make a monetary difference for you as well. Mm-hmm. So it matters to people. So that's kind of the gist of those rules, and if you want to read them in depth, feel free to.
Yeah. Now we got the wall. Oh, you got the flags.
Yeah, the flags. This is super fun. So we had a whole big long conversation about gates and flags and stuff, and there's a lot of different ways that you could analyze them. But I feel like I'm kind of proud of the flag portion, especially. we have that flags will be considered complete when a drone is more than 50% of the way around the flag after having traveled primarily in the direction, clockwise or counterclockwise, described during the course walkthrough. So basically, you got to go around the flag. If at some point you end up on the other side of the flag, you won't be considered to have been traveling primarily in the correct direction. So technically speaking, if you fly around the flag going the wrong direction, you have to fly the long way back all the way around it in order to receive that checkpoint. So it's sort of like you're winding a clock, and at some point you get it to tick, and that flag has been checked.
Yeah, and also like if you're going around a flag and then you have a midair and your quad freaks out and you somehow end up back on the side you started on, but you were already kind of at the end when you had the midair, you've completed that element by going halfway around, and then you've gotten thrown back behind it. So you're allowed to just continue on. It's as if you went through a gate, crashed, and then ended up on the front side of the gate again. You don't have to hit that gate a second time.
And we've seen that in multi-GP champs and all sorts of races. I think even DRL has experienced stuff like that. And so it's a pretty prevalent rule in drone racing where you wouldn't think that it is, but I think we've got a really good solution for that one. So.
I would also just, anyone watching, recommend do the flags beneath the flag. I like doing the flags above the flag too, but from a race director standpoint, if there's any question, didn't happen.
Yeah, and at some point I think we'll probably have flags that make that as clear as is necessary, and that's something we consider during our course design. And as we grow as an organization, I think that we have some tricks up our sleeve to make sure that that's pretty indisputable, because we've seen a lot of instances in drone racing throughout the past where it's questionable whether a pilot flew directly over the flag. So if we see that becoming a problem, expect it to get addressed, and we'll be learning and growing along with the pilots. Yeah, Hyper says #flags shouldn't go to infinity. I totally agree in the practical sense with that, Hyper, because we can't practically extend flags to infinity. But in the future, we may be able to practically enforce that. Maybe not. We'll see. We have
the wall.
I love the wall.
This
is a fun story.
So we had at Citrus Springs Finals, we had multiple instances where this came into play. And actually during the day as well.
Yeah.
So something that might not be obvious from first glance in the rule book is Street League races are run on a timer. And by that we mean in between races, there's a set amount of time from the end of one race to the beginning of the other. And the only thing that stops that timer is safety concerns.
Yep.
There's no way to stop it. So basically it's unless someone's on the course.
Yeah.
And if you are not ready, if you miss the announcement, if your drone is broken, if you just got to power cycle it again, if your radio is turned off on the line, all of these things, if that timer starts the race has begun. There's being prepared, having your equipment in good working order, being attentive so you know when your heat is part of the race. If you don't do those things, it doesn't matter if you're the fastest pilot there, you didn't show up for the race.
Right.
So, and we had that come up a couple times where pilots are used to, in general, when you do your weekend races, typically you wait around for your buddies. Oh, you having a video issue? All right, we'll hang out for another 45 seconds, a minute.
Right. And we've seen the biggest reason why we created the timer in the first place was because I think every race director has experienced this, where you have a pilot like, oh, I'm not ready, I'm almost ready though, blah, 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 and maybe it takes 10 minutes, or maybe they actually are ready. And as a race director, you end up in a really sticky situation where you have to make the call based on what you believe about that person. And the hard thing with that is that usually ends up having some sort of bias, right? Like, as a race director, you know something about that pilot. A lot of race directors are very familiar with the pilots who are participating in their races. And we wanted to make sure that bias couldn't be a means of unleveling the playing field, essentially. Because I've definitely seen it, even at a very high level of drone racing, where certain pilots get certain advantages because of who they are, or maybe what they represent, or what brands they are in charge of, etc. Like, the race director always has some sort of bias because they know the pilots at a personal level. I think that's true all across drone racing. And so I've spoken to several pilots who have experienced that bias, both from the positive side or from the negative side, where they weren't granted the same time allotments as other pilots and stuff like that. And so that was something where, in order to keep the race moving but also be completely fair across the board, we created this clock, and we really truly abide by that clock. And it's really unfortunate because we see situations where, like, you have to disqualify people, and it's hard. It always sucks. But what sucks more is having a pilot come up to you and say, like, you didn't treat me fair. You didn't treat me the way that you treat the other pilots. And that's something that we care a lot about at Street League, is that all of the pilots are treated the same, and there's no personal bias getting in the way of our ability to run a fair race.
Whether it's your first race or you're in finals for the final heat and it's the head-to-head for number 1 and number 2, you're not special.
Yeah.
Everyone gets treated exactly the same, and that the timer will start the race unless someone intervenes is part of that. The
unless
race
it's a
will
safety
begin.
issue.
Yeah, that's the only reason we'd stop it.
Right. And it's even at the point where the timer, like, I'm up there and I've got the race directing screen in front of me. Led, you have the race directing screen in front of you. You and I both can push the start button and the stop button to start and stop any race. The race will start itself unless we physically prevent it from starting itself. And so that's something where, by taking a portion of that control away from us, I think that we're doing a pretty good job in that aspect. And I think that this is something that other race directors and organizations hopefully will take note of.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is you end up on time. You can schedule your event because of this.
Right.
So right now, it's, I think in points rounds there was a 3-minute gap between when the last race stopped, so the last pilot finished, and the next race begun. And I think we only had to pause that for people to grab their quads once or twice. And in general, the pilots were ready early, and we were starting the races around 2 minutes after the last one, because all the pilots were there, they're ready. They say, hey, we want to go early, and if you want to go early, that's great.
The race will always start early if the pilots are prepared, so that's not an issue.
Where this became an issue was what we noticed was, if that timer is counting down, you're getting course call outs. 1 minute, course closed, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, and someone's having issues with their quad because it's an anxious moment. Energy's high. This countdown is happening, and you're just trying to get your damn quad to work. And what we saw was people were, the race was starting, and it was saying 10 seconds till race start, 5 seconds till race start, and people are standing over the starting line trying to fix their quad until that last second, which is a safety issue. Right. So we had to modify this rule. Is after the course closed call out happens, which I believe is 1 minute, but the time is not really important. Yeah. Over the radio or over the speaker is going to say course closed. You must immediately drop your quad and walk off the field. If you don't do that, if you touch the quad, if you have someone else touch the quad for you, if you don't immediately turn heel and leave, the race will stop. We'll stop the timer. We'll say, I'm sorry, whoever, you're disqualified for this round. You're not allowed to race. Leave the start line so that the race can continue. Yep. And by doing that, and having that disqualification potentially happen a little earlier, there's no safety concern anymore, and it turns it into a little bit of a process. But we don't want quads taking off in people's faces for obvious reasons.
Yep. So that's at the heart of this rule. It's mainly a safety thing, and it ultimately is just letting people kind of know like what the process is. Let's see what else is in there. We've got some different verbiage about pilots signaling that they are ready. In the future, we're hoping to bring some pretty awesome tech that should help the pilots indicate that they are ready. But until that tech is ready, the rules are a little bit agnostic to it. Let's see, the race sequence.
Oh, we did the if you fall off the starting blocks.
Yes, here down here. Okay, so pilots who leave the starting blocks early for any reason may be allowed to continue their round if they meet the following requirements. So basically, you false started, here's what happens. So the pilot may not be directly, the drone may not be directly interacted with by any person. Basically, you can't run out there and flip it, anything like that. The drone must be landed and allow all other non-false starting competitors to pass them such that there's no doubt that they did not gain an advantage. So basically, if you jump off the blocks early, your drone has to touch the ground. You have to actually land and allow people to pass.
You can't hover around behind the starting blocks and then wait for the race to start and then take off. No, you have to land the drone, the race starts, everyone passes you, and then you can take off behind them.
Yeah. And we actually had an example of this in Citrus Springs. I believe it was Mixed Signals, where he slipped off the blocks as he was trying to preload. And he ended up on the ground. He didn't try to like fly and hover and save it. He went throttle down and actually disarmed, and then he was kind of on the ground as the tone was going, and then he took off immediately. And unfortunately for him, that was I think that was the last round in one of the Elite 8 rounds, and I think that it put him far enough behind that he couldn't win, which was really a bummer to see. But what I will say about his piloting and his decision making at the time, it was really good because he did what, as a race director, we would hope that the rules would enforce, and that was that he made sure that he wasn't gaining an advantage by doing so. He made sure that he was actually going through a launch sequence, so he was on the ground when the tone let him by. And then he was also, one of our next rules is that you will be one of the last pilots going through the whole shot gate. Yes, so false starting pilots may not interfere with any other false starting pilot before the whole shot gate, or they will be disqualified and the race restarted. And then, actually it's point 4. So the false starting pilot must enter the whole shot gate after all other pilots who have entered the whole shot gate without incident. So you can't go through the whole shot gate before the other pilots.
If you fell off the blocks, even if you're faster than them in the first turn and you let them get ahead, took off, and then you're faster than them in the first turn, you have to enter that whole shot gate after them. That's where we measure. Okay, you false started. That's a measurable thing because we can see it. And then the timer is the first time we have data about you're in last.
Right, and we have this 2 little words here at the end. We say all pilots who have entered the whole shot gate without incident. So one of the scenarios that we thought about was, okay, maybe you false started, and maybe one of those other pilots fails to make it to the whole shot gate. And so in that situation, we would say they had an incident, and you are allowed to pass them at that point once they have had an incident.
So this is the level that we go into this, though, because this is a great example of this. So we're like, okay, let's say we're going to use Amari because he's absolutely cracked at Street League right now.
Fair enough.
So Amari false starts, right? He lands on the ground. And I'm in a race with one of my buddies and Amari. And I want my buddy to make finals because I think he's going to make finals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I go around, I do my hole shot, and right before the hole shot gate, I veer off course. Because
Mm-hmm.
now Amari would have to wait for me to get through the hole shot gate because he's
Right.
got to enter it last. So I can give an advantage to another pilot by holding him up. And that's the without incident is how we deal with that. If I veer off course, now I've had an incident, and now he doesn't have to wait for me anymore.
Right, because no good drone racing format ever incentivizes you to lose a race in a way that would gain you an advantage, and so that's what we're really attempting to make sure is the case here. So, yeah, that's our false starting thing, and with that, that is the conclusion of our rules overview.
Yeah.
If you have any questions, go ahead and email info@streetleague.io or hit us up on Facebook. We're on Instagram. Obviously, YouTube is where we're broadcasting this live stream. And yeah, if you have any questions about the rules or you think that the rules are missing something that's important, feel free to hit us up. Or in general, if you have questions about how to make sure that you're within the spec of the rules, I know we've talked about a lot tonight. Jump into our Discord. I'll see if I can get a link for our chat. And join the community because we've got so many helpful people that are always willing to chat with nerd stuff, be it rules or what have you. And ultimately, we have a pretty good time in there, I would say.
Oh yeah, our Discord's great. Super
Yeah.
active too. There's always people playing video games, and Circuit Superstars happens every once in a while. It's fun.
Yeah. So FP Vegan says, can you talk about battery cell count versus throttle cap? Why 5S? That's a really good question. So 5S, admittedly, was it was somewhat arbitrary, and then we reconsidered at one point whether it should be 6S. And then what we concluded was that 5S is cheaper, but 4S starts to hurt the competition a little bit because we felt that the battery performance suffered a little bit in 4S to the point where older batteries, it was basically a balancing act between the affordability and the quality of competition. And then the throttle cap was something that we did in order to make sure that we were future-proof. So the idea was that, well, so we have a couple of principles that we've applied to both the points structure as well as the actual drones themselves. And that philosophy is that there is a really important ratio in drone racing. That ratio being the ratio of top speed to the scale of the drone. Something that we really want Street League to have is racing in which the competitors have to contend with each other in a physical space, right? Because we believe that's what creates really exciting and compelling racing. If the competitors don't have to be considerate of each other as they go around a corner, if they're unconcerned with the space that their competitors are occupying, that's not really racing. That's just time trials. And, you know, we could watch people's DVR clips that they post on Facebook if we wanted to see that. But if you want to see compelling racing, then you have to have that ratio within an acceptable range. So that was the idea there.
So yeah, the 5S makes it so that like if you went the 6S, you could just run a higher throttle cap and then you'd have less battery sag, which is on its surface seems like a great thing for racing. The batteries cost more, which isn't good. The batteries are already expensive. We're trying to keep it as affordable as possible. The other thing is if you make it so that the drones don't have to be efficient, now it's not part of the race anymore. So all of our tracks are designed for I do my best to attempt to make the guys fly for a minute and a half wide open. So on that last lap, that last 30 seconds, battery sag becomes a big factor. And if your quad is very, very inefficient, then you're going to be slower on the last lap. And that's part of the spec. And you got to figure that out. So by, I think, a 4S battery, it would be too big of a deal where we couldn't race for 1 minute and 30 seconds anymore. And if we went to a 6S battery, it would be more expensive, and that efficiency and that battery sag on the last lap isn't really a factor anymore.
Right. And Vegan mentions that higher voltage cells are technically more efficient. But again, mainly it's the fact that we wanted the highest voltage battery that we felt was not cost prohibitive. And so 6S really starts to bump into that, even though technically we could just do more of a throttle cap and, you know, and like Led said, like the efficiency kind of gets lost anyway. So that's kind of where we ended up. The alternative was that if we did the higher cell battery, we would have to change the motors as well. So we could do lower kV motors. We could get that efficiency back because we wouldn't have to have such a high throttle cap. But then the other thing that we end up losing in that situation is the ability to either speed up or slow down the drones. So it was really a lot of like different tuning, mainly bouncing back and forth between those two spirit of our rules. So affordability and quality of racing. That's where we ended up. And it's possible there's something better, and I think that we'll look at it if we find that people are really enjoying a different kind of battery spec or throttle cap spec, and it's providing both of those things at a higher level, then we would definitely consider like switching it up.
And just before we get off batteries, I just want to mention, like, as much as like the batteries they're not cheap. Even like they're, anywhere from $25 to $40 a battery each right now. About a year ago, I purchased 6, and those are the same 6 batteries I'm running. So like, and I fly Street League every single weekend, pack after pack after pack. So how we're using them with the throttle cap and everything isn't that hard on the battery if you treat them nice. So they last a long time, and because we're using those throttle caps, you don't need a brand new battery to win. It helps. It's definitely helps, but like I've been qualifying for Elite 8s with year-old batteries at this point.
And that's a big deal when you're competing with the level of pilots that we've had at some of our races already. So, Vegan mentions he'd like us to talk a little bit about the open source frames, and I think that's important. This is a good opportunity to talk about it. So, open source is really important to us in a lot of the different facets of our organization. We feel that if we're attempting to compare pilots, we want to make sure that we want to make sure that any advantage that a pilot could have as a result of innovating and pushing the sport forward has a limited effect, because we do want them to gain something from it, at least temporarily, but ultimately we want to make sure that what they gain from designing the ultimate new frame, for example, or something like that, we want to make sure that that expires essentially. And then at that point, that advantage is disseminated throughout the community because knowledge is power, really. So with all of our frames and all of our prints, it's required that you open source both the frame and the prints in a way that would allow somebody to, if they had the tools, replicate that same design. And that is another effort also to make sure that brands have the opportunity to make money, but without becoming a monopoly of sorts. And I think right now we've kind of seen how frames aren't really the type of thing where there's no safeguarding mechanisms for the intellectual property of a frame. And so we felt like, let's just take that out of it. Let's not create an environment where people are pointing fingers of, you cloned my frame, et cetera, et cetera. Do the work yourself, become a retailer, and sell what it is you are trying to produce, and you will see the benefit from that. And that was our hope. Um, we see some stuff in the chat
Yeah.
talking about
I
5 inches dead.
so
Um,
so real quick before we get off the frames, because that's something else that we haven't mentioned tonight. Where like if you come up with this new frame and it's so much better,
mhm,
right? It has to be open source. So the next guy especially at the next race, someone could have built one by then, right?
yep.
The other place that we do that is with tunes.
Mhm,
So it's something we learned at all the way back at DRSL1, like
mhm.
when we were basically just
Like
doing this
preseason, I
by
guess you could
ourselves.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a pre-year. It was like the
Yeah.
first time that you guys convinced enough locals to have a race, and we everyone was running stock beta flight the whole time.
Mhm.
Um, and then Vanover shows up with a really spicy
Mm.
tune
Yep.
and absolutely changed the game. Everyone realized how much faster a tuned quad is.
Yep.
Um, and that caused a whole bunch of other things of people's quads flying away the next day. But we
Yeah.
got through that. But it became okay. Well, if you're an amazing tuner, how much of an advantage do you get? And
Right.
what we settled on is you get one race,
Yep.
because if you make podium with that super awesome tune, we're stealing the tune and we're posting it online.
Yep. And we do that as part of our post-race spec check. We pull your
Hmm.
quads, we pull the dump, and they get published along with um, your winning notification. And so
Hmm.
everybody uh, has that advantage going into next race. And if you want to keep innovating, you're going to have to keep doing it. You can't just sit on one innovation and win time after time after time if you're good enough at keeping secrets. Because we didn't want this league to be surrounded by secrets. We want it to be as transparent as we possibly can make it.
Yeah,
Um,
and like the things we learned doing that, and what did he do, and all of this stuff, like, um, it's 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 really part of the fun, and that's really how you end up pushing the sport forward, because everyone's standing on the shoulders of the people behind them.
mhm,
So if we can force you to support the next guy, you don't have a choice.
right.
Then like the quality of racing and the quality of how our quads fly and everything will
The
just get better
ecosystem.
faster.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Real quick, I wanted to jump on. We see some talk about 5 inches dead. Um, I got a little spicy a second ago, so I wanna caveat what I was saying. And I think it's important to examine also. So, when you're talking about the contending with people in a physical space, um, I guess in general, I'm usually referring to the 99% of pilots that participate in any league. I want those pilots to be contending in the space um, in order to experience racing. And so something that I didn't really mention, but is a really important caveat, and we see Hyper's protests in the chat for good reason. People like Hyper, Amari, Heads Up, Minchan, they are so well practiced at drone racing that they can be flying a very small drone going very, very fast. And because their lines are all so precise, they do have to contend with each other for that space. And they do have to legitimately race and legitimately make passes. What I would say though is that you have to have a level of reflex and a level of piloting ability and a level of investment in the sport that for a lot of people may not be attainable. It may simply be impossible for them to have, um, all the way down to like what you make financially, or down to simple biology. Like you may be too old to be able to do that. Um, and so I think that it's important to recognize that 5 inch is a very important. I won't say 5 inch actually. I'm going to say open class racing. Open class racing, very high speed, small, light drones um, are very important for pushing the raw ability of drones. Um, and I think that that has a place in the drone racing world. And I think that it should be a substantial portion of racing. And what Street League is hoping to do is bring into existence I'm not going to say a more classy type of drone racing, but a more refined form of drone racing. Like the idea is to create a level of drone racing where you're not so dependent on um, all of these different things to be able to come and try it out. Um, you should be able to do it regardless of who you are, where you're from, what manufacturers support you, etc. Whereas I think that in 5-inch racing, we're seeing that there are, I'm not going to say privilege, but like there's certain um, advantages that you need to have to be able to compete at a really, really high level. And I think all of the really fast pilots can attest to this. So I'm really excited
Yeah.
for Street League because I think you can have a lot less money and still make top 8 and still be competitive with the best pilots in the world. I think you can come and throw hands with Amari after having built your quad the weekend before if you've got the chops for it. And so I think it makes it a little bit easier to be able um, to contend at the highest levels without without destroying the actual competition itself.
Yeah, and something you touched on a little bit, how like the top tier pilots, Hyper and Amari and Minchan and Heads Up and Vanover, and even going up the list, if you go look at multi GP nationals, like I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how far up this list you go, where they really are doing these things we talk about, where
Yeah.
you're contending with the space and jockeying for position and these things. But as you go down through the list and then down into sport class and everything, the quality of racing that people get to experience falls off quickly.
Yes, I totally agree.
With open class racing, where even like people who are good pilots um, are really just doing their best to get through the track.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen with the Street League quads and spec drone racing in general, but especially the Street League quads, that fall off of people racing versus people just doing their best to get through the track happens much later.
Yeah. And
Like,
I think a great example is like actually I would say myself. So I was at 2019 Champs was my last multi-GP championship that I attended. If I remember correctly, I got somewhere just below the top 16, so just outside of getting into that bracket. I would argue, even though there were tons of examples of me having a quad in my face, that was kind of a rare experience for me. To be able to experience any level of close competition. But I would argue that I was not concerning myself with where those pilots were on the track. Um, and so I would say, like, if I remember right, I got like 18th in that event. And so I think at the 18th supposedly best pilot in the US, and that was actually an international event, I think you should absolutely see pilots jockeying for position and contending in the space down at the
mm-hmm.
18th position. And I think with Street League, I don't think I know, and we would have a lot of pilots backing us up, um, all the way down to like our D group. We definitely had pilots literally going blade to blade at Citrus Springs, and that was really exciting to see because I think that, to the point that you were making earlier, that gradient of having to contend in the space falls off much more slowly in Street League, and I would argue that it falls off more slowly than it does in any form of drone racing that currently exists. And
Yeah, and it's not just the drones. The drones are a big part of it. We've created the whole system from the top down to encourage that, from the tracks we're flying, which tend to be less complicated and easier to navigate. They're designed to be easy to fly the slow line.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to fly the fast line. So there's always that, do I want to take it easy a little bit and take the safe route, or do I want to go a little bit faster and take much more risk? And that stacks on that. So we have the quads that help encourage it by slowing everyone down. Then we have the track that encourages it by the easy lines are slower and the hard lines are faster.
Mm-hmm.
And where like we don't have corkscrews in Street League, we just don't do them
We
because
don't
the
do many
corkscrew,
of them.
Yeah,
much to Hyper's dismay.
We do very few because a corkscrew is just as hard whether you're going fast or slow,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then now on that stacks on that is we have the format where you're earning points every heat. And do I send it and try to pass this pilot right here and crash, or do I back off a second and I wait to pass them somewhere else on the course that's more advantageous and I have more room?
Yeah.
In the Street League format, you should wait. Do not pass that pilot right now. So all of these things work together to encourage pilots to fly in a way that's more fun, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. I think you put it very eloquently. Yeah, so this is Street League. We went a little deeper than just the rules tonight, but maybe we do more talking videos just to tell people a little bit about it. Maybe we do like some race reviews or something like that after, because this has been a pretty fun stream overall.
It has been. It's been a good time.
So this is Street League. As we announced at the beginning of the stream, we've got our new rule book. We're super excited about some of the improvements that should be coming from that. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and drop them on any of our social medias. We're on Facebook, Instagram. We've got a TikTok, although we need to do a little bit more with that. And then our main form of communication for all of our community and our pilots has been Discord to this point. We dropped a link to that earlier on in the chat if you want to scroll up to that. Highly encourage you to jump in and just come hang out, say hi. We play video games and talk about nerd stuff all the time, so it's a great community. And we're also looking forward to Cali Clash, which is coming up, gosh, is that in 1 week? A little over 1 week.
Yeah.
And that is hosted by Colby Cortola, who has been hosting those races for several years now, and he was so kind as to invite Street League to be part of it, and we're really excited for that. So yeah, check out our website if you're interested in going to that as well. Any last words to our viewers, Lud?
No, I think we covered everything we want to get through tonight and more, and I'm super stoked to see everyone out at Cali Clash and at the rest of the races this season going forward. I'm going to try to make every single one.
Yep.
Especially not just as a race director, I race at the same time, so I got to be very careful with that. That's
yeah.
Part of all that fairness stuff comes in. It lets me race and race direct, which is nice.
Yeah. But
and
cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lud, for joining us. Thank you to our viewers for watching, and we will see you next time. This is Sky FPV and Lead Fingers signing off.